From George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 39, The Holy Planet Purgatory. Reading 3. Now, my boy, to continue the further, more detailed elucidation concerning the process of the transformation of cosmic substances through beings in general, we shall take as an elucidatory example the common presences of your favorites. Although the process of the transformation of substances for the continuation of the species, by means of us or by means of the common presences of your favorites, does not proceed exactly as it proceeded in the first Tetartocosmoses, who were transformed into beings, nevertheless we shall take them as an example, since the process itself of the transformation of cosmic substances for the needs of the most great common cosmic Trago-Auto-Egocrat proceeds through their common presences exactly as it proceeded through the first Tetartocosmoses. At the same time you will acquire information concerning several other small details of the strange particularities of their psyche, and also gain information relating to how they in general understand and how they regard their being duty in the sense of serving the common cosmic process of Iran-Iranimanj, destroying for the beatification of their own belly every kind of law conformable, foreseeing actualization, for the welfare of the whole megalocosmos. As for those particularities of the transformation of cosmic substances, thanks to which the continuation of the species of different beings at the present time proceeds differently, for the present I will say only this, that the cause depends on the place of concentration of the sacred Ashagi Protori, or on the place of concentration of those cosmic substances which are the results of the last stoppender in the common cosmic Ansam-Baluisar. Now, my boy, I shall begin by repeating, all your favorites, even the contemporary, are like us, and like all the other three-centered beings of our megalocosmos, such apparatuses for the great cosmic Trago-Auto-Egocrat, just as the Tetartocosmoses were, from whom arose the first ancestors of the now existing beings, as well as the beings now existing everywhere. And through each of them, the cosmic substances arising in all 7 stoppenders of the sacred Heptaparshinok could be transformed, and all of them, again, even the contemporary, besides serving as apparatuses for the most great cosmic Trago-Auto-Egocrat, could have all possibilities for absorbing from those cosmic substances which are transformed through them what is corresponding for the coding and for the perfecting in them of both higher being bodies. Because each three-brained being arisen on this planet of yours represents in himself also, in all respects, just as every three-brained being in all our universe, an exact similarity of the whole megalocosmos. The difference between each of them and our common great megalocosmos is only in scale. Here you should know that your contemporary favorites very often use a notion taken by them from somewhere, I do not know whether instinctively, emotionally, or automatically, and expressed by them in the following words: we are the images of God. These unfortunates do not even suspect that of everything known to most of them concerning cosmic truths, this expression of theirs is the only true one of them all. And indeed, each of them is the image of God, not of that God which they have in their bobtailed picturings, but of the real God, by which word we sometimes still call our common megalocosmos. Each of them, to the smallest detail, is exactly similar, but of course in miniature, to the whole of our megalocosmos, and in each of them there are all of those separate functionings which in our common megalocosmos actualize the cosmic harmonious Iran-Iran-Umanj, or exchange of substances, maintaining the existence of everything existing in the megalocosmos as one whole. This same expression of theirs, we are the images of God, can here serve us as a very good additional illustration in explanation of how far what is called perceptible logic, or as it is sometimes still said, Mnofnian mentation, is already distorted in them. Although this expression corresponding to the truth exists there among them, yet concerning the consideration of its exact sense, as in general concerning every short verbal formulation, they at best always express with their strange, short-sighted mentation, even if they should wish with their whole common presence actively and sincerely to reveal their inner representation and essential understanding of this expression of theirs, something as follows. Good, if we are images of God, that means God is like us and has an appearance also like us. And that means our God has the same mustache, beard, nose as we have, and he dresses also as we do. He dresses as we do, doubtless because, like us, he is also very fond of modesty. It was not for nothing that he expelled Adam and Eve from paradise, only because they lost their modesty and began to cover themselves with clothes. In certain of the beings there, particularly of recent times, there being a Mnofnian mentation, or perceptible logic, has already become such that they can very clearly see this same God of theirs in their picturings, almost with a comb sticking out of his left vest pocket, with which he sometimes combs his famous beard. Such a super peculiar, being a Mnofnian mentation, about their God proceeded in your favorites chiefly from the Hasnamusian manifestations of those learned beings who, you remember, I have already told you, assembled in the city of Babylon and collectively began to invent various maleficent fictions concerning their God, which were afterwards, by chance, widely spread everywhere on that ill-fated planet. And in view of the fact that that period coincided with the time when the three-brained beings there began to exist particularly selves nel nualno, or particularly passively, in the sense of the being efforts proper to three-centered beings. Therefore, these maleficent inventions were thoroughly absorbed and appropriated by the beings. And afterwards, in their transmission from generation to generation by inheritance, they gradually began to be crystallized into such monstrous logic-nestanian materials, with the result that in the psyche of the contemporary three-brained beings there began to proceed such an already exceptionally distorted being a Mnofnian mentation. And the reason that they pictured their God to themselves just with a long beard was due to the fact that then, among the maleficent inventions of the Babylonian learned, it was said, among other things, that that famous God of theirs had, as it were, the appearance of a very old man, just with a heavy beard. But concerning the appearance of their God, your favorites have gone still further, namely, they picture this famous God of theirs exactly as an old Jew, since in their bobtailed notions, all sacred personages originated from that race. At any rate, my little Hasin, each of your favorites, separately, is in his whole presence exactly similar in every respect to our megalocosmos. I once told you that there is localized in the head of each one of them, as well as in us, a concentration of corresponding cosmic substances, all the functioning of which exactly corresponds to all those functions and purposes which our most holy protocosmos has, and fulfills for the whole of the megalocosmos. This localization, which is concentrated in their head, they call the head brain. The separate, what are called okaniaki, or protoplasts of this localization in their head, or as the terrestrial learned call them, the cells of the head brain, actualize for the whole presence of each of them exactly such a purpose as is fulfilled at the present time by the higher perfected bodies of three-brained beings from the whole of our great universe, who have already united themselves with the most holy Son Absolute, or protocosmos. When these higher parts of three-brained beings, who are perfected to the corresponding gradation of objective reason, get there, they fulfill precisely that function of the okaniaki, or cells of the head brain, for which function, as I have already said, our unibeing common Father Endlessness condescended at the creation of the now existing world to decide to use for the future those codings who obtain independent individuality in the Tatarto-cosmoses as an aid for himself in the administration of the enlarging world. Further, in each of them, in their what is called vertebral column, another concentration was localized, called there the spinal marrow, in which there are precisely those what are called denying sources, which actualize in their functionings, in relation to the parts of the head brain, just such fulfillments as the second-order newly arisen sons of the megalocosmos actualize in relation to the most holy protocosmos. It must without fail be noticed that in former epochs there on your planet, your favorites knew something about the separate particular functionings of the parts of their spinal marrow, and they even knew and adopted various mechanical means for action upon corresponding parts of this spinal marrow of theirs, during those periods when some disharmony or other appeared in their, as they express it, psychic state. But the information relating also to this kind of knowledge gradually evaporated, and although your contemporary favorites know that certain particular concentrations are in this spinal marrow of theirs, yet of course they have not the slightest notion for what function they were designed by great nature, and in most cases simply name them brain nodes of their spinal marrow. Well then, just these separate brain nodes of their spinal marrow are the sources of denial in relation to the separate shades of affirmation in their head brain, precisely as the separate second-order sons are the sources of the various shades of denial in relation to the various shades of affirmation of the most holy protocosmos. And finally, just as in the megalocosmos, all the results obtained by the flow of the fundamental process of the sacred heptaparaparshinuk from the affirmation of the most holy protocosmos, and from the various shades of denial of the newly created sons, began to serve thereafter as a reconciling principle for everything newly arising and already existing, so that in them also there is a corresponding localization for the concentration of all results obtained from the affirmation of the head brain, and from all the shades of denial of the spinal marrow, which results afterwards serve as a regularizing or reconciling principle for the functionings of the whole common presence of each of them. Concerning the place of concentration of this localization, which serves the common presences of terrestrial three-brained beings as a regularizing or reconciling principle, it must be noticed that in the beginning these three-brained beings of the planet Earth, who have taken your fancy, also had this third concentration, similarly to us, in the form of an independent brain localized in the region of their what is called breast. But from the time when the process of their ordinary being existence began particularly sharply to change for the worse, then nature there, by certain causes flowing from the common cosmic trago autoegocratic process, was compelled, without destroying the functioning itself of this brain of theirs, to change the system of its localization. That is to say, she gradually dispersed the localization of this organ, which had had its concentration in one place, in them, into small localizations over the whole of their common presence, but chiefly in the region of what is called the pit of the stomach. The totality of these small localizations in this region they themselves at the present time call the solar plexus, or the complex of the nodes of the sympathetic nervous system. And in those nervous nodes, scattered over the whole of the planetary body, there are accumulated, at the present time, all the results obtained from the affirming and denying manifestations of their head, brain, and spinal marrow. And these results, having become fixed in these nervous nodes scattered over the whole of their common presence, are later also such a neutralizing principle in the further process of affirmation and denial between the head, brain, and spinal marrow, just as the totality of everything arising in the megalocosmos is the neutralizing force in the process of the affirmation of the protocosmos and the various shades of denials of all the newly arisen suns. And so, the three-brained beings of the planet Earth are not only, as we also are, apparatuses for the transformation of the cosmic substances required for the most great Trago-Auto-Egocrat, with the qualities of all the three forces of the fundamental common cosmic Triamazikamno, but also themselves absorbing these substances for transformation from three different sources of independent arisings, have all the possibilities of assimilating besides the substances necessary for the maintenance of their own existence, also those substances which go for the coating and perfecting of their own higher being bodies. In this manner, those three sourced substances, entering their common presences for transformation, are, just as for us, a threefold kind of being food. That is to say, those substances which, on the path of their returning evolutionary ascent from the sacred Ashagi Purgatory, or from the last stoppinger of the fundamental sacred Heptapara toward the most holy protocosmos, were transmitted with the aid of their own planet itself into definite higher corresponding surplanetary formations, and enter into them for further transformation as their first being food, which is their ordinary food and drink. But those second-sourced substances, which, being obtained from the transformations of their own sun, and of all the outer planets of their own solar system, and which entered the atmosphere of their planet through the radiations of the latter, enter into them again, just as into us, also for further evolutionary transformation as the second being food, which is there, as they there say, air, by which they breathe, and those substances in their air just serve for the coating and maintenance of the existence of their second being bodies. And finally, the first sourced substances, which for them as well as for us are a third kind of being food, serve both for the coating and for the perfecting of the higher being body itself. Well then, it was in relation to those sacred cosmic substances that those sorrowful results occurred among your unfortunate favorites, which flowed and still continue to flow from all the abnormalities established by them themselves in the ordinary process of their being existence. Although the substances, also of this higher being food, continue to enter into them, also until now, yet they enter particularly into the beings of the present time, already only spontaneously, quite without the participation of their cognized intention, and only as much as is required for the transformations proceeding through them necessary for the purposes of the common cosmic, trago-auto-egocratic harmony, and for the automatic continuation of their species, demanded by nature. When the abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence were finally fixed there, in consequence of which there disappeared from their essence both the instinctive and the intentional striving for perfecting, there not only disappeared in them the need of conscious absorption of cosmic substances, but even also the very knowledge and understanding of the existence and significance of higher being foods. At the present time, there, your favorites already know only of one, the first being food, and they know about that only because, in the first place, even without their wish, they could not help knowing about it. And secondly, the process of its use there has already become for them also a vice, and occupies an equal rightful place alongside other of their weaknesses, which were gradually crystallized in them as consequences of the properties of the maleficent, for them, organ Kundabuffer. Up to this time, not one of them has yet even become aware that in this first being food there are substances necessary almost exclusively only for the maintenance of the existence of their coarse planetary body alone, which is a denying source, and that this first being food can give nothing for the other higher parts of their presence. As for those higher cosmic substances of which a certain quantity must, as I have already said, necessarily be transformed through them for the continuation of their species, and for the maintenance of the general harmony of the common cosmic ensemble luisar, your favorites at the present time have no need at all to trouble their inner God, self-calming about it, since this is already done in them, as I have already said, quite spontaneously, without the participation of their own cognized intention. It is interesting, however, to notice that in the beginning, namely soon after the destruction of the functioning of the organ Kundabuffer, in the three-brained beings breeding on this planet of yours, they also became aware of these two higher being foods, and then began to use them with cognized intention, and certain beings of the continent Atlantis of its latest period even began to consider these same processes of the absorption of these higher being foods as the chief aim of their existence. The beings of the continent Atlantis then called the second being food Amarlus, which meant help for the moon, and they called the third being food the sacred Armahudan, and this last word then signified for them help for God. Concerning the absence in the psyche of your favorites of a cognized need of absorbing these higher, sacred cosmic substances, I wish also to draw your attention to one very important for them, sorrowful consequence flowing from this, and namely, in view of the fact that in them, together with the cessation of the intentional absorption of these definite cosmic substances necessary for the arising and existence of higher being parts, there disappeared from their common presences not only the striving itself for perfection, but also the possibility of what is called intentional contemplativeness, which is just the principal factor for the assimilation of those sacred cosmic substances. Then, from that time on, in order to guarantee that the required quantity of those substances might enter into them and be assimilated, nature gradually had to adapt herself to arrange that for each of them, in the course of their whole process of existence, such unexpectednesses should occur already by themselves as are not at all proper to occur to any three-brained being of our great megalocosmos. Unfortunately, nature there was compelled to adapt herself to this abnormality, so that owing to these unexpectednesses, certain intense being experiencings and active deliberations might proceed in them automatically, independently of them themselves, and so that, owing to these active deliberations, the required transformation and assimilation of these necessary sacred particles of the higher being foods might automatically proceed in them. Now, my boy, as for the processes themselves of the transformation in the evolutionary and involutionary movements of all these cosmic substances, by means of just such apparatuses of the most great common cosmic trago-auto-egocrat, as all your favorites also are, then those transformations proceed in them as well as in us, and in general in all large and small cosmoses of our common megalocosmosis, strictly according to those two same chief fundamental cosmic laws, namely, according to the sacred Heptaparaparshinok and the sacred Trimausikamno. Before talking to you about the manner in which the cosmic substances, entering into beings as their first being food, are transformed in them for the purposes of the common cosmic trago-auto-egocratic process, and which enter into three-brained beings, if they have a certain kind of attitude towards this process, also for the coding and the perfecting of their own higher parts, it is necessary for you to bear in mind, for a clear representation of these processes, that in our megalocosmos, from results which have already flowed from every kind of trago-auto-egocratic process, there are many hundreds of independent active elements with various specific subjective properties which take part in new formations. These many hundreds of active elements, with various properties wherever they might be, proceeding from the 7 stoppenders of the fundamental common cosmic sacred Heptaparaparshinok, are, depending upon which stoppenders they received their primordial arising, divided and localized according to what is called the affinity of vibrations, into 7 what are called Octapanatsaknian classes, and all, without exception, of both the large and small, already definite concentrations in all our megalocosmos, are formed from these active elements belonging to 7 independent classes, and as I have already told you, they have their own subjective properties. And these subjective properties of theirs, and likewise their what are called proportions of vivifyingness, are actualized firstly according to what form of functioning of the 5th stoppender of the sacred Heptaparaparshinok was flowing during their arising. And secondly, whether the given active elements arise owing to the conscious intention on the part of some independent individual, or whether they arose automatically, merely owing to the 2nd grade law called attraction and fusion of similarities. Well then, these same many hundreds of definite active elements belonging to 7 different Octapantsaknian classes, and having 7 different subjective properties, among which the properties of vivifyingness and decomposition have supreme significance, compose in their totality the fundamental common cosmic ensemble Sar, by which the most great cosmic trago-auto-egocrat is actualized, the true savior from the law-conformable action of the merciless Herapus. It is necessary to tell you also that the first appearance of every kind of concentration from the ethereal-krilno, which is found everywhere in the universe, owing to the 2nd grade cosmic law, the attraction and fusion of similarities, proceeds in the following manner. If particles of ethereal-krilno, which are already found in the different spheres of all 7 stoppenders of the fundamental common cosmic ensemble Sar, collide for some reason or another, they begin the arising of all kinds of crystallizations which do not yet have any subjective properties. And furthermore, if these particles of ethero-krylno fall for some reason or other into conditions where a process of harnel-miatsnel proceeds, they fuse into one, and owing to what are called complexion vibrations acquired in them, are transformed into active elements, already with definite, specific properties. And if thereafter these already definite active elements, with their own specific subjective properties, enter into other processes of harnel-miatsnel, which have other conditions, they again fuse with each other according to the same law of affinity of vibrations, and thus acquiring other properties, are transformed into active elements of another octopanasocnian class, and so on and so forth. And that is why there are in our megalocosmos so many independent active elements with their different specific subjective properties. And if now, my boy, you satisfactorily grasp the succession of the process of transformation of cosmic substances by means of beings, apparatuses, into which these cosmic substances enter as first being food, then at the same time you will approximately understand everything concerning the chief particularity of the sacred law of Heptaparaparshinok, as well as the processes of evolution and involution of the other higher being foods. When these evolving active elements, in their returning ascent from the last stoppender of the fundamental common cosmic sacred Heptaparaparshinok, enter into the common presences of being apparatuses as their first being food, they begin already from the mouth itself with the help of the processes of the second grade law, harnel-miatsnel, that is, owing to mixture and fusion according to the affinity of vibrations, with the active elements which have already evolved in the presences of the beings, and have acquired vibrations corresponding to the subsequent stoppenders of the being Heptaparaparshinok, to be gradually changed, and are transmuted, this time in the stomach of the beings, into definite active elements named being Purgatory, which correspond in their vibrations to the ascending fourth stoppender of the fundamental common cosmic Heptaparaparshinok. From there, this totality, which has the gravity center vibration of being Purgatory, passing, thanks again, only to the process harnel-miatsnel, over the whole of what is called the intestinal tract, and gradually evolving completely, acquires in consequence corresponding vibrations, and is this time completely transmuted in what is called the duodenum, into being Diphteri. Further, a part of these definite substances of being Diphteri go to serve the planetary body itself, and also the local harnel-miatsnel, in respect of the newly entering food, but the other part, also by means of a process of harnel-miatsnel, of local character, continues its independent evolution, and is ultimately transmuted in beings into the still higher definite substances, which are called this time being Tritoeri. And this totality of cosmic substances, temporarily crystallized in the common presences of beings' apparatuses, which correspond in their vibrations to being Tritoeri, have as the gravity center place of their concentration in the presences of beings the what is called liver. It is just in this place of the being Ansambaluiasar that the lower Mznelin of the sacred Heptaparaparshinok is located, called the mechano-coinciding Mnelin, and therefore the substances of the being Tritoeri cannot, only owing to the process Harnell miat snel, independently evolve further. Well then, owing to that change in the general functioning of the primordial common cosmic sacred law of Heptapara, this totality of substances, named being Purgatory, can, in the given case, evolve further from this state only with the help of forces coming from outside. That is why, in this case, if this totality of substances of being Purgatory does not receive foreign help from outside for its further evolution in the common presences of the beings, then both this totality and all the definite centers of gravity of the being Ansan Baluyasar, crystallized up to it, always involve back again into those definite cosmic crystallizations from which they began their evolution. For this help coming from outside, Great Nature, in the given case, most wisely adapted the inner organization of beings in such a manner that the substances which had to enter into the common presences of beings for the coating and feeding of their second being bodies, Kesjin, namely, that totality of cosmic substances which your favorites call air, might at the same time serve as just such a help coming from outside for the evolution of the substances of the first being food. The active elements which compose this second being food, or air, and which enter into the presences of beings, also for evolution, through this second being food, beginning from the nose of beings, gradually evolve with the cooperation of various processes of Harnell miat snel, of local character, and are also transmuted this time in the what are called lungs of beings, into Purgatory, but into Purgatory called astral pneumonian Purgatory. And then the substances of this astral pneumonian Purgatory, entering into the presences of beings for their own evolution, and having still in themselves, according to the sacred Heptapara, all the possibilities of evolving from their centers of gravity by the process of Harnell miat snel alone, mix with the totality of substances of the first being food, which have already evolved up to the third stoppender of the sacred being Heptapara, and further evolve together, and thus help these substances of the first being food to pass through the lower mechano coinciding mtnelin, and to be transmuted into other definite substances, into being Tatartoari, and the astral pneumonian Purgatory itself is transmuted into the substances named astral pneumonian Defterori. At this point in my explanations, you can have one more clarifying example for a full understanding of the difference between auto-egocrat and trago-auto-egocrat. That is, of the difference between the former maintaining system of the existence of the Sun Absolute, when that system was auto-egocratic, and the other system now called trago-auto-egocratic, which it became after the creation of the megalocosmos. If the transformation of substances through beings' apparatuses proceeded according to the law of the sacred Heptapara, when certain of its stoppenders were not yet changed, that is, as it still functioned before the creation of our now existing megalocosmos, then the cosmic substances composing the first being food, entering into such apparatuses cosmosis, for the local process of evolution, would accomplish their ascent up to their completing transmutation into other higher definite active elements without any obstacle and without any help coming from outside, namely by the process of Harnell miat snel alone. But now, since the independent functioning of this primordial sacred law has been changed into a dependent functioning, the evolution or involution in its changed stoppenders must always be dependent upon external extraneously caused manifestations. In the given case, this extraneously caused help for the complete transmutation of cosmic crystallizations through beings into higher crystallizations is the second being food, which has entirely different causes of its arising and which must actualize entirely different cosmic results. I will sometime later explain to you in detail how the transformation of the substances of the second and third being foods proceeds in beings. But meanwhile, note only that these higher cosmic substances in beings are transformed according to exactly the same principles as the substances of the first being food. Now we shall continue to investigate just how, according to the sacred Heptapara Parshnuk, the further completing process of the transformation of the substances of their first being food proceeds in the presences of beings' apparatuses. And so, the ordinary first being food is thus gradually transmuted in beings into definite substances called being Purgatory, which have in beings, just as of course in your favorites, as the central place of their concentration, both of what are called the hemispheres of their head brain. Further, a part of this being Purgatory from both hemispheres of their head brain goes unchanged to serve the planetary body of the given being. But the other part, having in itself all the possibilities for independent evolution, continues to evolve without any help coming from outside, and mixing again by means of the process Harnel Miat Snell with previously formed higher substances already present in the beings, is gradually transmuted into still higher definite being active elements called Purgatory. And these substances have as the central place of their concentration in beings the what is called Cyanurinam, or as your favorites call this part of their planetary body, the cerebellum, which in beings is also located in the head. Just these same substances in beings, according to the fifth deflection of the sacred Heptapara Parshnuk, have the free possibility of giving, in the manifestations of the common presences of three-brained beings, results not similar but opposite to each other. That is why, in respect of these being substances, the beings themselves must always be very, very much on their guard in order to avoid undesirable consequences for their entire whole. From the cerebellum of beings, a part of these definite substances also goes to serve the planetary body itself, but the other part, passing in a particular way through the nerve nodes of the spine and the breast, is concentrated in the beings of the male sex in what are called testicles, and in the beings of the female sex in what most of your favorites call ovaries, which are the place of concentration in the common presences of beings of the being Gurdjieff, which is for the beings themselves their most sacred possession. You should know that this particular way mentioned is called Turnlava. Only after this are the cosmic substances which enter beings' apparatuses for the purpose of evolution, that is, for the possibility of passing the lower Mdnelin of the fundamental common cosmic exchange of substances, transformed into that definite totality of cosmic substances, which transformation is the lot of all beings in general, and also of your contemporary three-brained beings who breed on the planet Earth in particular, for the automatic justification of the sense and aim of their existence. And this totality of cosmic substances is everywhere called Gurdjieff. And so, my boy, this totality of their first being food, which results from the evolution in these beings' apparatuses, corresponds with its vibrations to the last stoppender of the being Heptaparaparshnuk, and according to the particularity of this stoppender, it enters the higher intentionally actualizing Mdnelen of the law of Heptaparaparshnuk. And in order to transform completely into new higher substances, and in order to acquire vibrations corresponding to the vibrations of the next higher vivifyingness, namely corresponding to the fifth stoppender of the fundamental process of the common cosmic sacred Heptaparaparshnuk, it inevitably requires just that foreign help which is actualized only in the presences of the three-brained beings, exclusively owing to those factors mentioned by me more than once, and which are manifested in the being part dolg duty. That is, owing to just those factors which our common Father, Creator, Endlessness, consented to foreordain to be the means by which certain of the tetrarchocosmoses, as a final result of their serving the purposes of the common cosmic Iraniranumaj, might become helpers in the ruling of the enlarged world, and which factors also until now serve as the sole possible means for the assimilation of the cosmic substances required for the coding and perfecting of the higher being bodies, and we at the present time call conscious labors and intentional suffering. Here it might as well be noticed and emphasized that of all the definite cosmic substances which are formed and in consequence are always present in the common presences of your favorites, they well know only this being exiory, which they call sperm, and even masterfully perform with it various kinds of their manipulations. And by this name sperm, they give importance to the totality of the definite substances formed only in the presences of the beings of the male sex, and ignore namelessly and with scorn a similar totality of the sum of the substances which arise in beings of the female sex. Just this same totality of substances, which inevitably always arises as the final sum in the presences of all beings from their first being food, became one of the chief causes of the fact that later, when they ceased to actualize being part dolg duty in their common presences, and this totality of cosmic substances in consequence did not receive, according to the sacred Heptaparaparshnuk, the required foreign help for their completing evolution into other definite higher active elements, it began to involve back in them towards those crystallizations from which their evolution began. And such involutionary processes in them began from this time to serve their common presences as factors which began to engender in their common presences the data for the arising of their innumerable what they call illnesses, and thus, on the one hand, began to de-perfect their previously established essence individuality, and on the other hand, to shorten the general duration of their existence. And your favorites, the beings of the planet Earth, particularly the beings of the present time, do not use these same substances of being exiory at all consciously, neither for self-perfecting nor for conscious reproduction outside of themselves of new beings similar to themselves. And these sacred cosmic substances, formed in them in such a manner, serve either only for the purposes of the most great cosmic Trago-Auto-Egocrat, entirely without the participation of their own being consciousness and individual desire, or for the involuntary conception of a new being similar to themselves, who is, without their cognized wish, a distressing result for them from the mixing of these sacred substances of the two opposite sexes, who actualize in themselves two opposite forces of the sacred Triamazikamno, during the satisfaction by them of that function of theirs, which has become, thanks to the inheritance from the ancient Romans, the chief vice of contemporary three-brained beings. I must sadly remark that the mentioned depraved inherency, already completely fixed in their common presences, is for them, particularly for your contemporary favorites, already and automatically acting means of destroying to their very root even those impulses which sometimes arise in them from manifestations worthy of three-brained beings, and which evoke in them the what is called thirst for being. I repeat, my boy, besides the fact that these favorites of yours, particularly the contemporary, ceased to use these sacred substances inevitably formed in them, consciously for the coating and perfecting of their higher parts, as well as for the fulfillment of their being duty foreseen by nature herself, which consists in the continuation of their species. Yet, even when this latter does accidentally proceed, they already accept it and regard it as a very great misfortune for themselves, chiefly because the consequences which must proceed from it must for a certain time hinder the free gratification of the multitudinous and multiform vices fixed in their essence. And in consequence of this, they, particularly the contemporary beings, strive in these cases by every means to prevent with their whole presence the actualization of such an accidental and on their part unintentional sacred manifestation foreseen by great nature. In the last centuries there, very many among them in whom data for all kinds of Hasnamusian properties were more strongly crystallized, even became specialists in aiding the destruction of such accidentally actualized sacred being fulfillments, and these specialists they call their makers of angels. Whereas this same being act, which for your favorites has been turned into their chief vice, constitutes and is considered everywhere in our great universe for beings of all kinds of natures as the most sacred of all sacred divine sacraments. Even many two-brained and one-brained beings of this same planet, such as, for instance, the beings called there hyenas, cats, wolves, lions, tigers, wild dogs, bagushis, frogs, and many others who have not in their what are called law-conformable presences any data at all which give the possibility of comparative logic, at the present time still continue, of course, only instinctively to sense this act as sacred, and manifest it only during those periods which were foredesigned by great nature for this sacred sacrament, namely, chiefly at the period of the beginning of a new, completing movement of that cosmic concentration on which they have their place of arising and existence. That is, during the period which three-brained beings everywhere call the diagnostics of the sacred sacraments of Ser Uasar, and which, on the planet which has interested you, are called spring days. Perhaps, my boy, you do not yet know anything about the sacred sacraments of the great Ser Uasar? Beelzebub asked his grandson. To this question of Beelzebub's, his grandson Hassien replied thus: No, dear grandfather, the details of this I do not yet know. I only know that these diagnostics are regarded among us on the planet Caritas as great holy days, and are called Helping God Diagnostics. And I know that for these great holy days, the diagnostics, all our beings, activists as well as pacifists, prepare themselves almost from the end of the previous holy day, and that one Lunias, before the beginning of these sacred sacraments, both old and young among us cease to introduce the first being food into themselves, and by various sacred ceremonies mentally give thanks to our common Creator for their existence. I also know that the last two of these solemn diagnostics are considered and called among us the Diagnostics for the glorifying of the first producer of each family. And that is why, my dear grandfather, every year during these Diagnostics we all remembered and talked only of you, and each one of us strove with his whole being to manifest the sincere wish that your destiny may constantly create for you those conditions of being existence which might aid you quickly and easily to bring your reason up to the required sacred gradation, and that thereby you might the sooner finish your present ordinary being existence, personally burdensome for you. With these last solemnly pronounced words, Hassien ended his reply. Very well, my boy, said Beelzebub, we will talk about the sacred sacrament of the Seruazar when we return to our dear Caritas. There I will explain to you sometime in detail where and how the sacred sacrament of Seruazar proceeds with the substances being auxiliary for the continuation of one's species, and on what occasions and in what way the mixing and subsequent results of the two kinds of auxiliary are obtained. One kind is transformed for the affirming principle in those beings' apparatuses, which on our planet Caritas are the beings activists, and on your planet the beings of the male sex. And the other kind is transformed for the denying principle in those being apparatuses which, among us on the planet Caritas, are the beings passivists, and on the planet Earth, the beings of the female sex. Come now, and let us talk about these higher perfected being bodies, that is, about souls, who come on to this holy planet Purgatory, to which all my foregoing explanations have referred.